Welcome back. This is our first lesson that's going to lead us into our new unit on the European Middle Ages. This is topic 8.1, Europe after Rome. So in this class, we're finally coming back to see what's going on in Western Europe. Last time we saw them, the Roman Empire had collapsed. It survived in the east as what we now call the Byzantine Empire. And we talked about the Islamic Caliphates, Asian empires in East Asia. We talked about African empires and societies. Then we went over and talked about the societies and civilizations in North and South America. And here we are back in Europe. We've left them alone for a while. Let's kind of pick up those pieces and see what happened. The goal here is for you to be able to explain how the collapse of centralized authority, that is a singular empire in Europe, created both insecurity and led people to accept new systems of power in exchange for protection from that insecurity. So let's take a look at the quick timeline here. I like to root us chronologically so you know what is going on. So some familiar events that we talked about in previous units. We talked about the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphate. So we know the Prophet Muhammad right here. That's when he founds the Islamic faith. Muslims invade Africa and from Africa and conquer Spain. So that's the Moors over here. Then we see the East-West Schism, the Great Schism that we talked about in the Byzantine Empire with the religious Christian faith. That's happening right here. Other events we've talked about that are going on right at the end here is Genghis Khan unites the Mongols, so that's kind of after this. The period of the European Dark Ages, or it's an antiquated old term phrase, but the Middle Ages, Dark Ages, medieval period, here's the Dark Ages right here on this timeline. So kind of right after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire till about the year 1000. And we call the medieval or Middle Ages period of Europe, you see extends far beyond that. So this is kind of the first half. This is what we're going to be talking about today, and that's going to lead us into kind of what's going on over here in our next in-class lesson. So if you remember the Roman Empire, it was a massive, massive empire that covered all the areas surrounding the Mediterranean Sea, the areas all the way up to in Britannia, the edges of Germania, Spain, France, these modern countries, Italy, Judea over in the east where Jerusalem is, Egypt. They're all part of the Roman Empire, and they're being ruled by the Roman Emperor. They're bringing Roman roads, aqueduct systems, construction, Roman concrete, theater, all this thing, courts. All of this is being controlled by a massive government with a huge bureaucracy. So civil service workers, they're making sure things are getting done and the people's needs are getting met so they don't, overthrow the system. But at the end, we saw there were a lot of problems. This led to the collapse. We're not going to kind of rehash the collapse. If you need to know that, go back to the notes or the videos, watch that about why the Roman Empire collapsed. But after the end of the Roman Empire, Western Europe is kind of a world without help. Roman soldiers are no longer defending the borders, so these outside groups come in and start attacking the local people, and there's no one to defend them. The road system that connects all these vast, faraway places, allowing trade to happen, they've fallen into disrepair, and there's no one defending them, making sure it's keeping them safe from bandits, so it becomes very unsafe to travel. There are no court systems functioning, so if you have a dispute with your neighbor over a contract or anything like that, or someone hurt you, you can't exactly ask them to be arrested and take them to court. No tax systems. All this is breaking down, and so there's no one central government that exists in Europe after the fall of the Western Roman Empire that's able to enforce order and security, so everyone's kind of left to their own devices to defend and protect themselves. Yet life goes on. People are still living their daily lives, growing food, gathering food, making things, raising children. They're still just trying to live, but the government doesn't exist anymore. There's no reliable protection. The Roman Empire is now in the West is now carved up into different Germanic kingdoms, right? You got the Eastern Roman Empire here, the capital of Constantinople, which, we know historians later renamed the Byzantine Empire. The Ostrogoths have taken this large chunk, so this is the Italian peninsula and Sicily. We got the Vandals have carved up down here, Sardinia, Corsica, where Carthage used to be. The Visigoths have most of the province of Hispania. You've got the Franks have carved up most of what becomes modern-day France, and you see them pushing over here into what becomes modern-day Germany. So there's a lot of different Germanic groups. Over here in Britannia, you've got the Britons, the Saxons, the Angles, the Scots over here, the Picts up here, and these are more native people. But you see that there's no one group that can provide protection for all the areas, or order and stability for all the areas that were once part of the Roman Empire. So power isn't disappearing during this period. Instead, it's breaking apart into smaller kingdoms. And that smaller focus is kind of key here. That'll lead to the question, what happens exactly when political power breaks apart? Well, first, trade declines as the roads and cities that people once relied on for all these resources start to kind of fall apart. People abandon the cities because they can't get the resources they need to survive there, as the food comes from the outlying farming areas and the roads are kind of falling apart and no longer safe. So people leave the cities and they return to more rural communities, right? So you go from living in massive cities like Rome into smaller manor-like systems here that are kind of tiny. I'm not even gonna call them towns, but like essentially they're just, I guess, tiny villages, places for the farmers to live, fields to grow. There's woods for hunting and wood, a blacksmith, a mill, and then usually a nice fancy house that your lord lives in, as well as a church to worship in. So your survival and protection is no longer guaranteed by some larger emperor of this massive political structure. Instead, survival depends on local conditions, what things are like very close to you. And so authority and power here shifts away from these large, bureaucratic institutions that provide safety, protection, trade, courts, all that. It shifts away from that to specific individuals. Power now goes to becoming personal, local, and very uneven. Different people in the system are going to have a lot more power than most people. I guess in that way, things don't entirely change. The big thing that changes is the scale of this power and who's in charge. So insecurity becomes a really big problem for people during this quote-unquote dark ages, or the beginning of the European medieval period. And this happens because the Roman Empire no longer has its army protecting its borders. Everyone's kind of left to their own devices. At the same time that's happening, there's this group of people up here from Scandinavia, in the Danish area, and these orange lines, you can see here, going to Iceland and Greenland, down to Britannia, the coasts, those are the Vikings, and they're constantly showing up, attacking, leaving, showing up, attacking, leaving, because they're not interested in conquering, they're just interested in getting as much wealth as possible from these areas that were once part of the Roman Empire. From the east, you got this group called the Magyars. Today we call the Hungary or Hungarians, and they're expert horseback riders, and they're coming in from the east, and they're now just running around, kind of doing the same thing. They're not necessarily interested in conquering and holding land. They just want to take the resources that were there. And then, of course, you've got the Saracens. You've got essentially Muslim groups coming in and attacking as well. They are mostly staying here. For instance, in what becomes Hispania. This is the Caliphate of Cordoba, or Al-Andanas, we talked about. That was once part of the Umayyad Caliphate. So all this is kind of coming in. These three groups are coming in doing hit and runs, some conquering territory, some just trying to take as much wealth as possible. And the independent kings, right, these local warlords, just don't have the resources to protect everyone. Just a quick side note here, you also notice the Vikings, they're coming east, and this is the one spot where they really go kind of into the mainland for the most part, at least on this map. I guess you can see kind of here a little bit too, but they go mainland, and it's though their descendants kind of mix with the local Slavic people here, and this is how you get the origins of the Russian Empire. So we don't really get to talk too much about Russia in this class until much later, but I want to introduce that now as kind of that narrative thread that we'll peek back to. You also see that through that. Look at them attacking, not conquering, but attacking Constantinople at this time. Insecurity, a real big problem. People are under constant threat from the Saracens, from the Magyars, from the Vikings, constantly attacking. So safety becomes super important, more important than having political rights or having a say in, what the government's doing. So even those semblances of like, well, we get a vote and have a Roman Senate, who cares if you have Vikings constantly coming around and killing everyone you know and love and taking all your wealth? So the central question here shifts from who's in charge to who's going to protect me from these threats. And that's they may seem similar, but it is an important distinction, right? We're not questioning who has the power to tell me what to do. It's who has the power to keep me safe. Safety is key here. So the big question here is, how do people respond when governments can't protect you, right? They can't guarantee protection. The warlord kings of these different kingdoms cannot protect you from the Magyars, the Vikings, right, or the Saracens. So what do you do? Well, in a situation where it's between death or giving up a lot of your rights and, be controlled by someone else, you're willing to accept unequal relationships because, well, you may not have a lot of freedom, but at least the person in charge is keeping me safe from being harmed or killed by these outside forces. So people are trading independence for stability, and that's important here, right? This is a trade-off. People are willingly trading off their freedoms in exchange for stability and safety in life. They're willing to do the work of their local lords. They're willing to give up food to their local lords in exchange for those local lords keeping life stable and safe for them. This is a rational choice shaped by fear and scarcity. There's just not enough resources going around. That's an important word. Lack of resources to meet your needs. Essentially, this is what feudalism comes down to. The feudal system is, I will work for you, I will obey you, I will let you pretty much do most things, and I'll even give you a lot of what I grow, the food that I need to survive. I'll give you some of it so you don't have to grow your own, but you got to keep me safe. You got to protect me from those outside threats. And that's the deal we're going to strike. My freedom for safety. Entering into this story is the Catholic Church, who matters quite a bit in this story. The Catholic Church remains strong and organized after the Roman Empire, quote-unquote, collapses. So the Roman Emperor and his governors and his armies, they've all kind of fallen apart and fallen away. They don't really exist anymore. Local warlords control things, but even they don't have the resources to keep people safe. At the same time, the Catholic Church is still very well organized. The Pope is at the top. He's got cardinals who are kind of like nobles and bishops and priests, and these are an entire system built out so that he doesn't have political control over all the people of Europe. It is a way to keep spiritual control over the people of Europe, over the religious belief system of the people in Western Europe. It's the educated leaders within the Catholic Church that then shape shared beliefs across the regions of Western Europe. They give moral authority to fill in the gaps left by weak governments. Essentially, do these things because the law says so. Now it's do these things because it's part of their religious belief system. So stability is offered to people in this time of crisis and insecurity through a sense of belief and tradition. Another way to think about this is, yeah, the world outside is pretty chaotic with all those Vikings coming after us, but you know what? Even if my life isn't great right now, and even if, I'm being mistreated by my noble, they're keeping me alive, and what? Maybe I die. Okay, but if I follow these moral rules, these teachings of the Catholic Church, I will live on forever in eternity in heaven, so, there's that can keep me going. But you cannot talk about the Catholic Church and the Germanic kings as separate. These two are very, very much interlinked. The Germanic kings didn't have a Roman-style bureaucracy of, government workers who make sure things run smoothly and everyone is loyal to the state because it provides services and things like that. They didn't have that. And their military power alone wasn't sufficient to control populations. They didn't have enough soldiers to have everyone follow them by force. So the church steps in and solves this problem for them. It gives them legitimacy and approval, essentially saying, I, the Pope, will name you the king because I, the Pope, who, according to the religious belief system, speaks to God, heard from God that God wants you in charge. So all fellow followers of the Catholic faith must respect that God wants you in charge of this kingdom. So the authority, the power of these kings comes from the fact that the Pope, who everyone thinks speaks to God in this faith, has said that God wants you to be king. So in exchange, the kings offer protection and support to the popes. So now you have authority and power in Western Europe grounded in belief as well as force, right? The church gives you authority because God wants you, these kings in charge, and the kings have power because, well, I will try to protect you from these outside threats, and if you don't, I have some soldiers that can force you to. So belief and force become the two sides to this coin that keeps authority going in Western Europe after the collapse of Western Rome. So this marriage between the Germanic kings, the political and military power of the Germanic kings, and the religious authority of the Catholic Church actually happens pretty soon after the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West. And it starts, most historians point to it starting with a Germanic king named Clovis, who is the king of the Frankish people. And the Franks are the Germanic people who they moved after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. They've moved in, they invade the area that becomes France, right? The area that the Romans called Gaul. And Clovis converts to the Catholic faith in 508. I'm not going to give you all the details about that. What's important is he converts to Christianity in 508, making it kind of the official religion that he wants to follow and he wants his supporters to follow. And this creates an alliance with the Catholic Church. So many people in this territory are already converting to Catholicism, and by him converting and getting basically the blessing of the Pope and getting the support of church leaders and elites, it strengthens his control over the people by giving him religious legitimacy. It's not just that he's in charge because he has the strongest army or he's the son of some previous Frankish king. He is the king because God wants him to be king. So it gives him a better claim to being in charge than anyone else who might say, no, I should be the king, whether it's another relative of his or some other powerful warlord. And this is what establishes the Frankish kingdom that will one day become the modern nation state of France. So this is kind of the beginnings of that. Now, this relationship kind of continues, but the next big point here comes 400 years after Clovis with a man named Charlemagne, who became ruler of the large Frankish kingdom 400 years after Clovis. He still did not have the large bureaucracy that Rome had to help him maintain control over this large territory. Instead, he relied on local nobles and the Catholic Church to keep order. Now, how he uses local nobles, we'll get into that in our in-class lesson on how feudalism works. Right now, we're focusing on the Catholic Church because they're the ones who grant him the religious legitimacy of staying in power. In 800 Common Era, the Catholic Pope crowns him emperor in the city of Rome. This is seen as a really, really big moment because for the last 400 years, the Western Roman Empire has disappeared. In the East, you got the Byzantines. They still call themselves the Roman emperors, but they're out there. They've kind of receded. Western Europe's been left to itself. There's been no, quote, Roman emperor, and the Pope in the city of Rome crowns Charlemagne as emperor, right? His authority now comes from this church-state partnership, and his power is justified through religion, not the Roman institutions of the past or some central government. Essentially, I'm in charge not because I provide these services, not because I have military or institutional control of everyone. It is I'm in charge because God put me in charge. Don't believe me? Ask the Pope. Now, what's kind of interesting here is if you look at this map of Europe for the Charlemagne Empire, sometimes called the Carolingian Empire, the dark red areas show this empire, which the Frankish Empire, the Carolingian Empire, a lot of different names. Don't worry about it. Essentially, you see this dark red area. This is the area of the Frankish kingdom before Charlemagne. These light red areas are areas added by Charlemagne, and you can see here these tannish areas are tributary areas that are independent, but they offer you tribute to the Carolingian Empire, to the Frankish kingdom, in exchange for not being conquered. This is massive, right? This is kind of the biggest thing in Western Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire. And Charlemagne being named Roman Emperor, or at least Emperor in Rome, is kind of how this area starts to get the name the Holy Roman Empire, which is history's biggest joke because it was once it becomes the Holy Roman Empire, known as that. The joke is it wasn't holy, wasn't Roman, never really an empire, but we'll get to that joke later. This is just kind of where the seeds of this begin. A lot of times it's also why Charlemagne is referred to as kind of the father of Europe. I also like to point out that, with the Roman Empire, right, power was really centralized down here in the Italian peninsula, and up here was the kind of the wild provinces. You got the Germanic territories, Gaul conquered by Julius Caesar, but power really shifts from down here to up here. The wild, untamed areas now become the dominant power areas, whereas down here, this is more periphery. Here is the center of spiritual power, at least, because the Pope still lives in Rome, but political power has shifted north to the outlying areas of what used to be the Western Roman Empire. I just think that's an interesting shift to point out. Now, also of note here is the Emirate of Cordoba, or the Umayyad Caliphate, or the Kingdom of Al-Andalus, whatever you want to call it. You notice the Muslims are still kind of over here. The Byzantines are over here. This is going to become important later on in our story. This is where we need to rethink the term Dark Ages, right? The Dark Ages are used to describe this period of the fall of the Roman Empire, and it was really a term used by someone during the Renaissance period who was writing and describing it kind of how things seemed to be more backward during this period after the fall of the Roman Empire. Things got smaller. Essentially what he's referring to is that the light of knowledge of Rome kind of disappeared from Western Europe. The things the Romans knew how to do no longer kind of existed, And that's what they're referring to by the darkness of it. There's also all these attacks going on. Of course, there's maybe some evidence there might have been a little ice age during this, so the temperatures in this area of the planet were getting a little cooler. But the term Dark Age isn't exactly accurate, right? It was used because Roman government, cities, and long-distance trade did decline after Rome. There are fewer written records that do survive from this period. There is some writing, but not as much as the periods that came before it, and definitely not from the period as much as what comes after it. So later historians call this kind of intellectual darkness because there's just less left behind by people who are writing because of the downfall of the Roman institutions. There was no central political authority, right? Power was fragmented. It became much more local. And this was drastically different than we saw under the Romans. But despite all this, people did continue farming. They continued worshiping and organizing communities. This period represents more change and adaptation to a challenging time period than the disappearance of society, right? It's just something new comes from it. There's this pressure. There is this outside force. Something happens and people need to react. This is the story of how they react and create new systems in order to, meet these challenges. So, as we move forward, this should raise some questions, right? Central authority collapses. There's no one single empire or political authority anymore. So new systems are going to emerge to restore order and protection because people want to feel safe. But that new system will come at a cost. There's always a trade-off. So our core anchor question here that I want you thinking about moving forward, not to write out an answer, but again, this is something you should be able to answer in your head to show you mastery of this, is that if no strong government can protect you, what are you willing to give up in exchange for safety? And this is the question that's going to set the stage for understanding of our feudalism lesson when we come back to class and the growing power of the Catholic Church that we'll be addressing as we move forward. As always, I want you to end this with rewriting today's goal from the top of the note sheet. So that's what you were supposed to get out of this. 3 complete thoughts, 3 complete concepts of what you learned from this lesson. And what's one question you still have that I can answer for you to give you a bit deeper understanding of this, right? Try to keep this less surface level and show me you're really thinking here, guys. All right, I'll see you next class.